Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Roderick Geo channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at a new video about Brazil. That's right. How did Brazil become a country? By Knowledgia? Knowledge Gaia. Knowledgia? I don't know how to pronounce his name, but Knowledgia here has a video where he goes into depth and detail. And I just want to say, I did not watch the video, but I looked through the video. Absolutely stunning. Just the way that he does the details with the maps. Absolutely love it. So we're going to go ahead and watch this, and then we're going to go ahead and take a look at the comments afterwards. If you want to go to this video in this channel directly, I will post a link to this video in the description below, so make sure to go and check that out. Check a look at it. Yeah, I subscribe to every channel that I react to, so make sure to, if you enjoy it, check a look at the content, check a look at the channel, give them a subscription as well. And yeah, without further ado, I say let's go ahead and get into it.
With a population of over 200 million people,
200 million people. That's 100 million less than the U.S. and yet the country size is almost rivaling the mainland U.S. But then again, you also take 200 million and you put it up, prop it against like a lot of Asian countries, and it's like like India, for example, has like what 1.4, 1.5 billion people, something like that, or even is it even more now? I don't even know. It's a lot of people, but compared to Brazil, 200 million. I mean, 200 million is still a lot for the region and the area. But sorry.
Life on its territory potentially dating back over 30,000 years, Brazil is a nation with a long and robust history.
Yep.
While its border touches nearly every other South American country, besides being the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, Brazil stands
It's a little awkward.
out from its neighbors in a very relevant way.
They're Portuguese. They speak Portuguese there. Is probably what he's going to say, right? Because all the neighbors are Spanish colonies, and Brazil was a Portuguese colony, so they speak Portuguese. That's one thing that a lot of people mistake. I'm just assuming that's what he's going to say. But yeah, a lot of people mistake that. They think that people in Brazil speak Spanish, and it's kind of insulting in a way that you just automatically assume they're from South America. They speak Spanish, right?
It was colonized by Portugal,
yeah,
not Spain. But how did this happen? How did Portugal shape Brazil? And how did the latter become the country that it is today? The first Portuguese explorer to reach Brazil did so in either the final years of the 15th century or in the 1500s exactly. According to Duarte Pacheco Pereira's book, Esmeralda de Cito Orbis, he had found Brazil back in 1498 while on an expedition for King Manuel of Portugal. But this is not the generally accepted timeline. Instead, it's usually asserted that the first Portuguese expedition to reach Brazil came in 1500 with a fleet commanded by Pedro Álvares Cabral. He was actually on his way to India, but had been blown immensely.
If you take, all right, sorry, it's ironic. If you take a look at my channel, I do a lot of Indian content, right? I take a look at India. I have a huge fascination with India. I can't get away from India. It's so funny. Even in a video where I'm reacting and trying to learn information about Brazil in it itself, or completely other side of the world, India still comes up. That's just how that shows you the prevalence of India. And how important India was to the world. And it's just like, it's crazy to me that I went through my entire life not knowing a single thing about India. But anyways, we should get back to the video.
Immensely off course, and eventually spotted land. This led the fleet to make landfall at Porto Seguro, or Safe Harbor, and started the timeline of Portuguese colonization. Once it was realized that this newfound land was on the Portuguese side of the Tordesillas line, the initial goal was to establish a settlement with the focus of monopolizing trade, particularly of the widely popular pau-brasil redwood trees. This, of course, brought the Portuguese into direct interaction with the vast indigenous population in the area. At first, It's believed that the Portuguese settlers and the natives may have worked in harmony to harvest and trade the pau-brasil, but this was predictably short-lived as the situation evolved. As the redwoods were increasingly cut down and used for trade, more and more of Brazil's coast was being flattened, and there became a need to push farther and farther inland to find the trees. As one consequence of this, many of the colonists began to consider alternative forms of resource production for trade, such as the establishment of plantations. Thus ended the collaboration between the Portuguese and the natives, as the former decided that the best way to work their plantations was by enslaving.
Okay. Terrible. It really is tragic.
The latter. The result of this was the death and fleeing of dozens upon dozens of indigenous who either hoped to escape slavery, had fallen ill to newly introduced European diseases, or would later die in slavery due to the extreme labor conditions. Those who did flee were not guaranteed safety either, as Jesuit missionaries and Portuguese bandeirantes would push inland, exposing the escaped natives to disease nonetheless, and at the hands of the bandeirantes, enslaving even more.
Wow.
By the mid-1530s, Brazil had been divided up into over a dozen individual colonies to be owned and governed by the affluent Portuguese nobles, though all but one of these settlements would eventually be returned to the Portuguese crown in 1543, as they had failed to truly succeed. A new governor-general was subsequently sent to manage the territory, and a capital was established in Salvador. The Portuguese were not the only European power that wanted in on the action in Brazil, however. Aside from the occasional border dispute with Spain, Portugal didn't have to worry much about their Iberian neighbor thanks to the Treaty of Tordesillas from the century prior. It was this agreement that clearly placed Brazil into Portugal's realm of expansion, not Spain's, although outside of Iberia and the Pope himself, who had passed the papal decree solidifying the treaty, no one really accepted these boundaries. As a result, France, England, and other colonial powers were eager to reach Brazil themselves and take what lands they could.
It really is a wonderment why they didn't have more influence on that area, on the territory. Or maybe they did. Maybe they did, and I'm about to learn about it. But from my understanding, it was mostly Portugal that had the biggest and largest influence. I mean, I know France had French Guiana. They carved out that part, and that part is still technically a territory of France. It's like it is France. So Brazil, funnily enough, borders France, but
The French in particular tried to wedge themselves onto the map, but were consequently beaten back by the Portuguese in the latter half of the 16th century. The Dutch as well would take a shot at seizing part of Brazil, but they too would eventually give in to the possessive Portuguese. And while the Portuguese did manage to hold strong against their outside rivals, within Brazil, some issues began to arise that required fast solutions. Facing a growing need for slaves and a declining local population, Portugal looked to Africa to boost its Brazilian colony. The indigenous population in Brazil had been greatly reduced, but at the same time, the settlers in Brazil had an increasing need for workers at their plantations and elsewhere. It was at this time that the Portuguese looked to Africa. Having already kick-started the Atlantic slave trade the century prior, they now looked to bring workforce from Africa over to Brazil instead of Europe. Doing so would open the transatlantic slave trade, which would go on to have its own dark history over the centuries.
Wait, so the transatlantic slave trade was more initiated by the Portuguese wanting to bring people to Brazil? Is that what he's insinuating here?
Workforce from Africa over to Brazil instead of Europe. Doing so would open the transatlantic slave trade, which would go on to have its own dark history over the centuries. But for now, it served as Portugal's solution to the dying off native population. And the Portuguese didn't do this in small numbers either. In fact, Roughly 40% of African slaves involved in the transatlantic slave trade would end up in Brazil.
Yeah, a lot of people from the U.S. Think that the main amount of slaves went to the U.S., but I mean they went all over across the Americas. But yeah, Brazil played a huge part. I know that Brazil had a huge amount of slavery going on. Again, just really unfortunate.
Over 8 times the amount that ended up in the United
Oh
States.
yeah, the United States had 5% of the slavery of the slaves. The slave trade was only 5%. Only 5% compared to Brazil's 40%. Wow.
Nevertheless, despite the grotesqueness of their method of choice, the Portuguese in Brazil managed to find great success in trade and developing the colony altogether. New minerals and resources were found in Brazil that could be exported at high rates, while additional trade markets would also be opened up as the Portuguese had more to give. By now, Brazil was beginning to resemble its modern form, as its culture diversified and the capital was moved to Rio de Janeiro. This preceded another period of considerable change and movement toward contemporary Brazil, now in the early 19th century, when Napoleon decided to shake things up back in Europe, and also in South and Central America. The Portuguese royal family would be forced to flee their homeland and opted to stay in Brazil while they were away. Upon their arrival, there sprouted a newfound motivation to put more effort into Brazil's local economy and development than had been done prior. This helped to shift Brazil from just a tool of Portugal to its own functioning entity and ultimately primed it for independence. Schools, banks, and other important structures were built, more ports were opened, and Brazil began to flourish.
So you can think of almost as like Brazil. I mean, I don't want to say it owes its independence to, well, France, but then see if it's like if you say that, then you're like, okay, well, Brazil would have been its own independent thing if the Europeans never went. But the way it is today, Brazil kind of owes it to France for causing conflict in Europe, thus leading to, like you said in the video, the Portuguese royalty moving to Brazil. I mean, it all would have been avoided if the Europeans never went, to the west. But yeah, can't change history, unfortunately.
It was at this time that the royals could finally return home to Portugal. But Pedro I, the son of Dom João VI, was left behind to govern Brazil on behalf of Portugal, although he had other ideas. Once left to his own devices,
it was like one of it might even be his wife. It was one of like the queens or the princesses or someone that actually led Brazil's to their independence. But I guess we'll find out. I
Pedro
don't know the
decided
exact
that
story.
Brazil deserved more than Portugal could give, and was worth more than it had ever been given credit for. So he declared its independence.
Oh.
Previously, in 1815, Dom João had declared Brazil to be its own kingdom, although it would remain under the watchful eye and heavy hand of Portugal until September 7th, 1822. Independence or death, Pedro is said to have shouted from the banks of the Ipiranga River upon announcing the newfound sovereignty of his adopted nation. He was soon crowned as Emperor of Brazil, just in time for a building threat from the Portuguese, a threat
Interesting.
that would lead both sides into a bloody war. The Brazilian army and their local militia allies would clash with the Portuguese forces until the end of 1823, as they grappled for control over the former colonies. Fought by land and sea, the war would ultimately end in Brazil's favor when the final Portuguese garrison backed down, leaving the newly independent state in shame. The following period for Brazil was far from easy nonetheless, and internal struggles would eventually lead Pedro to abdicate his throne to his 5-year-old son, Pedro II, and subsequently handed the empire over to a line of regents who would rule in the young boy's place until 1840. Clashes with Brazil's South American neighbors would furthermore test the sovereignty of the young nation.
Oh yeah, for
But
sure.
nothing seemed to dampen the spirits of Brazilian trade, nor immigration into the country. Nevertheless, Brazil's time as an empire would shortly come to a close in 1889, a year after slavery was abolished by the monarchy. In its place was founded the Brazilian Republic, known now as the Old Republic. By
The
1930,
Brazilian
after a
Republic. I've
string
not heard
of
of this.
generally mild presidents, Getulio Vargas would seize power with a military coup and ruled as a dictator until 1945. The following decades were scarcely less turbulent, however, although efforts were being made by elected presidents to stimulate Brazil's economy and development. Through the 1960s, Brazil would fall under the control of the military, which would command the nation with its harsh methods until 1985, with inflation soaring. The economy was struggling, to say the least, even as Brazilians adopted a new constitution in 1988, and inflation would remain a dreadful obstacle until the 1990s. From
Wow.
that point on, though still entrenched in
I had no idea it was a lot more recent than this. Huh. I thought for sure, like, okay, the old republic and then dictatorships and
deep economic
I
and
had no
political
idea.
struggles, Brazil showed resilience nevertheless. And through it all, it had shown the ability to become and remain independent. Had Portugal never colonized its land, it's hard to know what Brazil would be like today. But thanks to the Portuguese colonization,
If Brazil never, or if Portugal never colonized Brazil, the Brazil would just be another Spanish colony, right? It would be under the territory of Spain again. It was going to be one of the two either way.
that did happen, wherever it stands morally, Brazil was able to become a notable colony and later kingdom of its own. And
Interesting.
thanks to the help of the exiled monarchs from Portugal, the colony turned kingdom would soon become a sovereign empire turned republic. Natural resources and reliable trade additionally helped Brazil to put itself on the map, and today it stands as not only an independent country in South America, but as a unique nation among its neighbors, as the only product of the Portuguese side of the Tordesillas line.
Huh. Okay. You know what? I really enjoyed this video. I really did. The way that he does the maps is beautiful. Like it is incredibly appealing to me. I highly enjoy this design. So this video overall was really good. A nice little quick little quick introductory into the history of Brazil. I feel like I have to learn even more about Brazil now. Because I thought for sure that I knew some of the things, and apparently some of the things that I knew were wrong. And yeah, it feels like there's just so much more history and backstory to Brazil that I just don't know, man. Like, where have I been? Why is the world's history just not? Why did I just not learn the world history when I was younger? Now I'm spending my entire adult life trying to understand everything, which is fine. It's enjoyable to do that, but okay. Well, that was knowledgia. We're going to take a look at the comments now. Remember, if you want to take a look at this video directly, it will be in the description down below. But yeah, it's time to look at the comments. First, we'll take a look at the top comments, then we'll search the newest comments and see what's up. Viva Brazil from Serbia with love. Nice. Brazil is a beautiful country. Hugs from Timor Leste, Lusophone brother. Okay. From 14 Portuguese exploration capatencies. I don't know what that word is. To one of the largest nations on the planet, Brazil shines like a star in the southern hemisphere. I like the animations, but you skim through the major events that cannot overlooked. Yeah, I felt like it was everything was very rushed at the end, but it is a shorter video. In 1815, the capital of the Kingdom of Portugal was effectively moved to Rio de Janeiro, and as such, when the king decided to return to Lisbon, it was perceived by the local elites as demotion, hence why they supported the independent movement. In the subsequent war, 1822 to 1823, Pedro the Fourth, later Pedro I, wife, was the daughter of the powerful Emperor Francis I of Austria, and she had ambitions of becoming the empress of her own. He left the country because his father had died and believed he had the legitimate claim to both the King of Portugal and Emperor of Brazil, and eventually reuniting both countries. Only after 10 years of his absence, the Brazilian crown decided it had been too long and has seated his son, Pedro II, as the new emperor at 14 years old, not 5 as stated. Then you jumped all the way to 1889 without mentioning the most important war in South America, the Paraguayan War, that solidified the national identity and liberal reforms of slavery. 1850 ban on the transatlantic slave trade. 1871 the Free Womb Act. 1884 provinces were allowed to ban slavery on their own. You also did not mention that both the 1871 Free Womb Act and the 1888 Golden Law, the effectively banned slavery countrywide, were signed by Pedro II's daughter, Isabel, who was widely disliked throughout the country. The 1889 coup was a direct response to her actions, as she was the heir to the throne. If conscientiousness was a concern, there was no point in citing anything afterwards. There was no concern of this independent henceforth. By 1930, next point in their timeline, Brazil had already fought in World War I and became the founding member of the League of Nations. If you're going to talk about coups in Brazil, you need another video since it happens every 20 years or so. Whew, yeah, that's it. Just like the history is like so much more. I definitely need to look and see if I can find some more videos. Hopefully, some people can recommend in the comments down below something more to make like I can take a look at it. The geopolitical history of Brazil through the times. Um, Transatlantic hug for our Brazilian brothers. Great country, long live Brazil. Brazil was supposed to have been a great superpower. It had the manpower, resources, and knowledge, but it was always politics will ruin everything. Long live Brazil. Love from India. Beautiful, kind, colorful, smiley friend, Colossus, Brazil. Our pride and our friend forever. Long live Brazil from our brothers in Portugal. Brazil borders most countries in South America with the exception of Ecuador and Chile. It is one of the largest countries in the world, along with the United States. Hugs to all the Brazilian brothers from Portugal. Brazil is one of my favorite respective countries daily and ever in this world and other planets and planets. Okay, and quite a fascinating history on the whole. Good and friends. Long live Brazil. Just a correction, from 1960 onwards, presidents no longer stayed in Rio de Janeiro as the capital was transferred to Brasilia in the center of Brazil. True, Brasilia is like right here ish. Let's take a look at some of the newer comments. Some of the newer comments can be interesting. Portuguese pirates plundered so much that they had nothing to show for now. How did Brazil become a country? Because of Portugal. Hugs from Germany. I love Brazil. Naughty Pedro. This shown that even the closest relative could be your traitor, but in the case did work. The Indians discovered Brazil. The Portuguese only got angry and used violence. Every Brazilian knows this, and today we are the most relevant country that speaks Portuguese. The Indians discovered Brazil? What do you mean the Indians discovered Brazil? The Indians discovered Brazil. Um, Brazil was never colonized. It was part of the Empire of Portugal. Brazil, Algarve, Rio de Janeiro was the capital of the empire in 1763. Brazil has always had special treatment different from the African colonies. I think it immensely disrespectful to end the video with thanks to the Portuguese colonization, as though thousands of indigenous people did not lose their lives over the greed and power, alongside thousands of African people who were stolen from their homelands to be brutally enslaved. To all those watching this video, take everything you learn from history with a grain of salt, as it's abound with biases. Sorry for question. Which country are you from? Why does that matter? Why does that matter? Yeah, I mean, again, yes, it's absolutely tragic what happened to the indigenous people there, and again, yes, it's terrible that the slave trade was propagated by you know the colonizing the new world. Man, okay. It's very easy to learn. Thanks. I'm Brazilian. This is surprisingly accurate. Most, if not all, videos I've watched on the subject have quite a few inconsistencies, to put it mildly. This is the 90s rendition of our history, reflecting its values at the time is quite lacking. The most complete version I've come across on YouTube is on Geodide's channel. I'll have to take a look at that channel. I've not heard of this channel. With all the resources of similar size to the U.S., why is Brazil not even a tenth of the fraction of the size of the U.S. economy? Please, someone help with this understanding. Um, Governmental issues is a main key factor. Even now, like the tariffs are so incredibly high in Brazil that getting anything in and out of Brazil costs so much money that people typically don't do much trade. And then just like the geographical way into the country in of itself, like this whole mountain range right here, it impedes a lot of connections between like the mainland and the coastal region. But maybe someone in the comments will specify a little bit more here. Where was it? Um, right here. Okay. Brazil has the same GDP as Russia, which has larger territorial and has more valuable resources such as gas and oil. It is in the top 10 largest economies. It takes us much longer than U.S. to begin our industrialization and urbanization. Our elite was satisfied with a rural country until 1930s. They thought that Brazil could be a power just through the agricultural sector, as there was never a lack of land to plant. But the reality is that they left us stuck in the time while other countries built factories. People will, with this ideology, still exist today, and we call them liberals. 60% of the Brazil territory is forest, Amazon. In the 1850s, the BIP per capita in Brazil was higher than the US. Brazil became just failed in the XX century. So the cutting of wood and rainforest for profit and luxury items from colonizers or neo-colonizer Western companies and abusing indigenous people for the same purposes began in the 1500s still goes on in the 2024. Palm oil, chocolate, coffee, soy, hardwoods. Why learning history at school if we don't better ourselves? I'm trying to quit coffee is quite addictive. I sort of stopped eating chocolate. I must change our consuming patterns for all of us on this planet, or just, eat ethically sourced versions of those, right? We are still using computers, cell phones, etc., and driving a car. Dude must probably be a vegan Democrat with a Tesla. Even you can't even Teslas, even cars, like computers. He's right. All these resources that we use on our everyday, our phones, our computers, the batteries that we use in like electric cars, do cars themselves, are all, unfortunately, all the products inside of them are gathered in means that are unethically sourced, right? It's especially batteries and like electric vehicles. Like if you are looking at like an more, if you're thinking that electric vehicles are a more ethical side, absolutely not. The mining for lithium is, whew, it is not only devastating to the planet, but it's also devastating to the miners themselves. Um, Okay. When it comes to Brazil, Portugal made history. Viva Brazil! I'm proud of all my lovely Brazilian people from Pakistan. As a Brazilian, I don't love your country. Oh my god. Okay, I think with that I'm done. Thank you for watching, everybody. Again, the video's on the link is in the description, and if you liked the reaction, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below. Recommend me some more Brazilian videos, maybe I can get to them. With that, take care. Goodbye.